Hi, my name is John Feig. I'm going to be doing a screencast of my Mirror API presentation. This is the same presentation that I will be giving at the Google Glass workshop that Lawrence Wong and I are hosting at Andreessen Horowitz on April 6th. And this presentation focuses on Mirror API using Java. This is going to be broken into several parts. The first part will be the generic Mirror API presentation. Code samples will be using Java. So first we'll go over a couple prerequisites. We need Java 1.6 JDK installed. You can use any IDE or text editor. Basically all you need to be able to do are open text files and edit them. You need Maven installed. A Google account. This is for setting up your project in the Google Developer Console, and so that you can get your API credentials. You also need access to a command line or terminal. It helps to be a little familiar with how to use those. Okay, so here's the super quick start. You're going to clone the repository linked. It's just the Google Glass Java Quick Start that's provided by the Glass team. And if you're using an IDE, you will want to import it into that IDE. We'll add the credentials. You'll move them into the right spot, obviously. And then you can run Maven install and Maven Jetty run. Hopefully at that point you should have it working and it shouldn't be crashing or anything. And then in your browser you can go to localhost :8080, and in another tab you can visit the next link, which I believe is just the sandbox. Yeah, so I'll show you how to use this in just a moment. So the next thing is to play around with Quick Start. Click the buttons, see what it does. So we can hit this here. Okay, so now you should see get redirected properly. Okay, so we're going to allow that. Now we're going to get redirected. Okay, so here is the sample app. So we can, click the buttons and saw it updated here in the screen. Insert a picture, and we should get another card here. And yeah, it's looking good. Okay, now I'm just going to show you what's showing up in my glass when I click those buttons. Okay, here is the main time and everything, and if I just swipe over, you can see those cards showed up in glass. All right. So what is the Mirror API? What is it? What does it do? How does it work? What's the flow? So many questions. To answer the first question, there are two ways of creating glassware, and the Mirror API is just one of those two ways. The other option is using the GDK. Mirror is a REST-based API, whereas GDK is client-side on Glass, very similar to Android. As a rule of thumb, you should use Mirror if you can. There's a lot of nice things that Mirror gives you for free. It's a lot easier to build glassware that conforms to the design guidelines, and there's just a lot less code involved. So if you can get away with using Mirror, then it's probably the right thing to do. It's also more constrained, easier UX, user experience, as I mentioned, and battery friendly. What does it do? Well, Mirror handles push messages from the server and responds as necessary. The server pushes a message to Glass. Glass displays the content as a timeline card. How does it work? Well, it uses GCM at the bottom layer, which is Google Cloud Messaging, just like Android uses. It sends and receives messages. Sending only requires internet connection and Oauth. So you don't really need a server technically to be able to do this. You could run it from your computer, even though there's no way to get back to your machine from Glass, or you can even run it from an Android device. Receiving does require a publicly addressable endpoint, and typically you really want to have that behind an you want to have an SSL certificate with that so that you get a secure connection in both directions. Really, you probably want that for sending as well. So security is good. What's the flow? Well, Glass registers with Google servers. You send a request to Google servers. Google servers then communicates with Glass. Glass responds back to Google servers, and then Google servers respond to you via callback URL. So many questions. Yep, let's step through this in detail. So first we'll take a look at the topics. We have OAuth, timeline, which includes cards, location, menus, subscriptions, and contacts. Okay, now I'm going to go over OAuth. So instead of looking at the slides, I'm just going to show you how to do it in the browser. So we go here, console.developers.google.com/project, create new project, give it some fancy name. You can have it, whatever. This just kind of auto-generates a project ID for you. Create it. This is new. It tells you what's going on since this is kind of just running in the background. It'll take a few seconds, so we'll just wait for it to finish. Hopefully it won't take too long. Oh, there it is. Okay, so now it's saying it's done with that. We're going to go to the APIs section, and we're going to turn off these extra APIs that we don't need. The only thing that we need here is the mirror API. So one more to turn off, and now we can find mirror somewhere in here. Google Mirror API. Okay, you see it's capped at 1,000 requests per day. It did not used to tell you that. That's kind of nice. Okay, so next we're going to go to credentials, and then we will do the next step from here. Okay, now we're going to generate our key. Click on Create New Client ID. It's a web application, that's what we're doing. We don't need this example.com, so we're going to get rid of this line. We're going to say http://localhost:8080. And that should be good enough. So create client ID. I'm just going to start generating stuff here for us. Great, now we have a client ID and a client secret. So now with the client ID and client secret, I'm going to jump back into the presentation. Okay, so we've done that. And what you can do is you can add this file, the oauth.properties file, or update the file if you already have it, and replace the this client ID thing here with the client ID that you have over here. That whole thing. It's a string, so you want to treat it like that. And then client secret is client secret. So yeah. And if you're at the presentation, I will actually have a copy of this for you to download. Okay, quick note. I mentioned it's a string, but actually you don't need to wrap it in quotation marks. So just a quick correction there. Okay. Now you've got your OAuth properties file set, and we can start looking at some code. But before we look at code, I'm just going to explain a little bit about how this flow is going to work for users. So what's going to happen is first, a user is going to visit your site, click Install Glassware. They're going to get redirected to Google, and it's going to show them their account or accounts, and they can pick an account to sign in with, hopefully the same account that they use for Glass. And then they're going to get some permissions that they'll have to accept. And then there's going to be a redirect that sends them back to your site. which will include a code in that redirect. You're going to parse out that code and exchange it for a token. And then once you have the token, you're all set. Although the token will expire, and if it expires, you're going to have to do a re-request. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now that I've explained at a high level how the Oauth dance works, let's look at some code. So here's the GET request that's being handled on the server side. So this is like an initial GET where the user is unauthenticated, and we're going to say, okay, you now have to go be authenticated. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a URL for them that just kind of appends this Oauth2 callback, and that's going to be the redirect URI. And then we set a couple parameters and redirect the user to that that URL. And it's just a Google URL, so like these things are part of the API, and yeah, makes it kind of nice and easy. Okay, so now we're coming back from Google servers, and you can see that we've gotten a code back from Google, and then we're going to want to exchange that code for a token. So you can see in the rec we're going to get the parameter code, and then that goes into the token response. And you see that we're, again, sending a redirect to this Oauth2 callback. And that I think we just use that to handle a lot of these authentication requests. So it kind of knows like how to deal with any part of the auth flow. It's stuff that we build in there to make sure that it's handling that. And we also set that up, if you remember, in when we were creating the client secret and key, the client ID and secret, we had set the Oauth2 callback, and this was the part of the path that we appended to do that. Anyways, we'll get this back from Google. We'll get a user ID as well out of the response, and then we can, store. This is specific to this this quick start, but we're storing the credentials in like an in-memory storage. And then we're going to send them to the new user bootstrap. Yeah. And here's really quick the flow, what it looks like for the user. We land on some web page, and this get it here button represents our like install or send to glass button or something. Click that, and then you're going to see this account selector page. You'll choose an account, and then you'll ask it. It'll ask you to accept the permissions. So you click accept, and then you're in. I don't have a thing for that, but once you click, then you're good to go, and you can start interacting. Which leads us right into starting to talk about timeline and cards. So we're going to talk about what is the timeline, why a timeline. What are cards? How do I insert cards into the timeline? Okay. So the timeline is, I've got this little video from Glass. I guess I'll just play it here, although you can go look at it for yourself. It's the Google Glass, how to use a timeline. And yeah, there you go. What?
This is your timeline. It's a row of cards. Things to the left are happening now or coming up, like the weather, an upcoming flight, or an event in your calendar. You can tap on any card to see more. Swipe down anywhere to go back to the timeline. Cards to the right of the home screen are from the past, like messages, videos, or photos. Tap on a photo to share it. Choose one of your friends. Swipe down to go back to standby.
Okay, so that's Google's little thing about the timeline. So what is the timeline? Well, the timeline is a collection of cards, starting from the latest or the most recent, and then going backwards in time. It includes pin cards, so you can, if a card allows you to pin it, you can do that, and that kind of keeps it in the future section of cards. So there's also a section of things that are happening in the future, which is like Google Now. Why a timeline? Well, I'm not quite sure. I wasn't privy to the discussion, but I can make a couple guesses. First, there are navigational issues with Glass because you have a very restricted ability to input. There's no keyboard, there's no mouse, there's no touch screen. You just kind of have this long touchpad on the side. With the timeline, you don't really need to dig into hierarchies very much. You'll get bundled cards, but those really only go like one level deep for the most part. You don't have a recent apps section. You don't have a launcher, which again, it makes it a lot easier to very quickly get the information you want to get. You launch apps with voice commands that do things. So, for example, the Strava app I'll launch with, "Okay, Glass, start a bike ride." And it launches immediately, and then there's no history in the app. So it just tells me exactly like what's going on at the moment. The timeline's push over pull. So you're kind of pushing out these notifications, things into the timeline to alert the user that something's happening. You get 7 days of stuff before it kind of falls off. Old stuff's stale, and you don't really care about it. I don't remember the last time I've gone past like a couple days old digging for stuff, and really, it's very rare when I do that. Instead, you typically want to go to the service itself, so you'll like go to your computer or your phone to dig for older things. You don't really want to do that on Glass. It's just it's kind of a lot easier and faster to do it from your phone. Cards. So, what are cards? Well, they're items in your timeline. They contain messages that you send to Glass, and they might allow for some actions to be taken on them. So here's a couple examples of what cards look like. You also get bundles, which is one card that you can tap on and expand, which like kind of takes you a level deeper, and then you can see these individual items here will each have their own card. So here's some code for inserting a card into the timeline. Very simple. We just say new timeline item. Again, this is Java, so we're going to say new timeline item. Set the text of that. Set the notification. So we want it to, kind of beep at us when we get it. It's helpful. So you just set it with this new notification config.setLabelDefault. I don't know why it's so verbose, but there it is. And then use mirror client to insert timeline item with the credential. So that's it. You've inserted something into the timeline. Okay, next we're going to talk about locations. Locations do one of two things. You can push a location to Glass, which would be something you would do for navigation, which is this example here. Or you can request the user's location from Glass via a subscription. So an example of this would be the Field Trips app, where basically Glass reports to the Field Trips Glassware service periodically. I think it's once every 10 minutes is how frequently you get a location via a subscription. And then the service kind of does some stuff, and then it says, oh, you're near this landmark. I'm going to tell you that this is close by, and you can go check it out if you want. So pushing location to glass is pretty simple. We are going to create a new location object, set the address, which is just a string, set the display name. Here I'm using the same string, but you could set it to something a little bit more descriptive. And then you set the latitude and longitude. And then you create a new timeline item and set the location against that timeline item. And then from there, it's the same stuff with the timeline item. You can just, you might want to set. You need to set a menu as well. So that's not included here, but in order to get the navigation menu item to show up, you actually do need to set that as a menu item. I have an example of code for that somewhere. So hopefully, I think we'll get to it in the part where we're reviewing the Java code for this. So you will see that. Okay. So now we can talk about location subscriptions. Of course, you can also subscribe for location updates from Glass to your service, and that's all you need to do according to the documentation. This is kind of outside the scope of what we're doing here today, so because it requires a server to be set up, which we don't really have time to get into, like an actual publicly accessible server with. Typically you want the SSL connection, and that's just kind of, it's a lot to do in a short amount of time, so I'm leaving it out. Hopefully this is all you need. You also will need to add a new permission into the scope when you request, when you're sort of getting authenticated, like you need to add that permission there so that you can, your requests are successful. So this is interesting because it enables contextual glassware. It enables glassware that knows more about you and that can do a better job of giving you the things that you want. For example, you might have Starbucks glassware that offers you discounted coffee when you're nearby a Starbucks, right? Like, you might not be thinking otherwise that, like, hey, I want coffee right now, and you're driving by a Starbucks, and it's like, hey, you can get a cup of coffee for 50% off or whatever. So that's something that you could do with a location subscription, or like I mentioned with the Field Trips app, that works. That works pretty well. It does get a little verbose, especially if you're never kind of taking those actions. So you can learn from the responses that people have too. If you're feeding them information about a location and they never take action on it, you might want to think about adjusting your approach. So now we can talk about menus. These are things that you can do with the card. So you can see one here where we're going to add a comment to something. So typical menu items are delete, reply, read aloud, navigate. And then there are custom menus like link feeds, really useful save to pocket menu item. And here's a little bit of code about the menus. So how to set, so you can say if we get a card in that this menu has been set on, you should be able to click it and you should see two menu items. One is read aloud and the other is delete. Subscriptions. We talked a little bit about subscriptions in the context of location, but you can get subscriptions for other things as well. Here's a little bit of code on how to do that. But you can get subscriptions on share, reply, delete, custom. A custom menu that's been clicked, you can find out that the user clicked it. Location updates and voice commands. So share, some of these are things that will send, the users consciously kind of trying to push information to your glassware. So that's kind of like the share and reply. Those are a lot more obvious to the user. Like delete is kind of useful if you want to know, you want to keep track of how the user is interacting with your service. Let's see. Voice commands, yeah. So subscriptions require a server. You have to have a server because you have to have a publicly accessible endpoint that Glass can reach. It should be done with SSL, but you can use tools like ngrok and to get the route of the local host. Although ngrok doesn't necessarily play nice with Java, there are other tools that do that. Again, you can't do this with localhost, unless you use one of those tools. So they're very good for analytics. Outside of the kind of direct response things where the user is consciously pushing data back to you. Since we're talking about building this contextual experience, we want to learn as much as we can about the user's behavior so that we can continue to send them things that are relevant, things that they want to see. So, one thing is like if we're listening for deletions, we might want to know which types of cards they delete the most that we send them. Like if we're a news feed and they're constantly deleting sports news items, like maybe we don't send them sports news. Subscriptions can also listen for custom menus, voice commands, and locations. Evernote, if you say take a note, will send text to the Evernote glassware, which is pretty useful. Okay, gone over that. Okay, so here's what I've been talking about with subscriptions, a few typical types. Here's a little bit more code, how to insert a subscription. Pretty straightforward. Okay, and then reply. So this is a thing that you're going to send explicit content back to your service. Here's something. If you're kind of just developing this thing, and you don't have your SSL certificate set up yet, or you're not at your final URL, or you're on a dev instance or whatever, you can use this mirror notifications.appspot as a redirect or as a proxy. It just like kind of pushes stuff through. Don't do this for production. It's not good. For one thing, I think you'll get throttled. For another thing, it's just it's insecure, so don't do it. But useful for development. Contacts. Contacts are people and glassware that you can send data to. This is a little strange to say, but really the people that show up as contacts represent some endpoint on glassware, right? Like if you have to have like something that handles them, right? I suppose your default contacts, like maybe that's a little bit more ambiguous, but for anything else, if you're in your app, creating things that look like people, they're really glassware because if you're using Mirror, that is, you're going to have to kind of come back to your service to route those messages through to the people who are being represented. So if if you have, like, say, a texting app, and you create contacts for, that represent the people who that user has in their texting app, and you're using Mirror to shuffle messages to and from Glass, then your messages go out, and then the user's going to say, okay, reply. And when they reply, where does that message go? Well, it goes back to your glassware, and then you need to know to route it to the correct person. So that's what I mean when I say that people kind of are actually also glassware. But you can also have more abstract contacts, like, let's see. So here's an example of what contacts look like. I'm going to come back to the code in just a second. So an example of a slightly more abstract contact would be, for example, if you take the service Pocket, and if Pocket wanted to have some glassware, what it might do is just have a contact that receives text, and you can it might listen on the share. It might subscribe to the share event. So that what you could do is, if you get a message in that has a link or something, or if you're browsing and you have this web page, you could maybe share it and go to the Pocket contact and send that to Pocket, so that that link would get inserted into your Pocket list. That would be a pretty nice thing for them to do. I hope they do it. But let's take a look at the code. Pretty straightforward. So we're just going to create a new contact, set some ID on that contact, a display name, how that person shows up, an image URL. So again, like if we look here, display name, image, right? Makes sense. And then accept commands. So I just was mentioning about Pocket, how Pocket might listen on the share. So if you have Evernote, it's going to listen on take a note in the Evernote contact. Evernote would be the display name, and you might have an elephant is the image, right? And then you're just going to insert that with that contact using the Mirror client. So pretty straightforward. And then that's it. From here, we're going to jump to looking at the code, which is going to be a separate screencast. So that's all for this one. Hopefully this was helpful for you.